The morning of December 7th, 1941, began with a stillness that felt like peace. The sun rose over Pearl Harbor, painting the water gold, and the crew of the light cruiser USS Helena went about routine duties at berth 1010. Across the harbor, the great battleships of the Pacific Fleet stood proud and silent. None of them knew the storm was already on its way. At 7:57 a.m., the first Japanese planes broke through the clouds like hawks diving for prey. The scream of engines shattered the calm. Sailors froze for an instant, then chaos took hold. One of the torpedo bombers, guided by Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, spotted Helena and made a fatal assumption. From the haze, her tall masts and heavy silhouette looked like the battleship Pennsylvania. The bomber released a single weapon, a Type 91 torpedo that sliced through the harbor waters at 40 knots, leaving a white wake aimed straight for Helena's hull. Moments later, the weapon struck at frame 75. The explosion tore through the cruiser's side with the force of a giant's hammer. Boiler room number 2 and engine room number 1 became a tomb of twisted metal and steam. Dozens of men were killed instantly. Water rushed in, flooding compartments faster than the pumps could handle. On deck, fire rolled outward in a wall of black smoke. But Helena did not die. Within 2 minutes, her forward diesel generator roared to life. Power surged to her gun mounts, and her anti-aircraft crews swung into action. Japanese planes swooped low, strafing the harbor. The gunners of Helena replied with defiance, sending streams of tracer fire clawing at the sky. 4 bombs exploded close aboard, each near miss rocking the ship like an earthquake. Shrapnel tore across her decks, but the cruiser fought on. Below, damage control teams waded through waist-deep water to seal ruptured bulkheads. Oil fires burned around them, filling the passageways with choking smoke. Men coughed, shouted orders, and worked by feel when the lights went out. Above, corpsmen turned the wardroom into a surgery, blood mixing with seawater as they tried to save the wounded. When the smoke finally cleared, 40 of Helena's crew lay dead, more than 100 wounded, yet she still floated. Across the harbor, the wrecks of Arizona and Oklahoma burned, black plumes rising into the morning sky. The men of Helena watched in stunned silence, realizing what they had survived. In the confusion of that day, Japanese pilots reported Helena as sunk. They were wrong. She had taken a blow that should have killed her, but steel and willpower kept her alive. The ship that had been mistaken for a battleship would become something far deadlier, a survivor that remembered. By the time the fires were out and the harbor quiet again, Helena's legend had begun. The machine gun cruiser was wounded, but her heart still beat beneath the scars of Pearl Harbor. Long before the fires of Pearl Harbor, before her name became a battle cry, Helena was nothing more than a dream of steel. The year was 1936, and America was still crawling out of the Great Depression. In the Brooklyn Navy Yard, amid the clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches, a new kind of ship began to take shape. She was known only as Hull Number 50, the second of the street. Louis-class light cruisers, leaner, faster, and deadlier than anything before her. To the workers who riveted her plates, she was a lifeline. Men who had lost everything during the Depression found purpose in the echoing caverns of the shipyard. They worked through the cold, their breath turning to mist, sparks lighting their faces as they forged the backbone of a vessel that would one day outlive them all. They didn't know it, but each bolt and beam they laid carried the weight of history. Helena stretched 608 feet from bow to stern. Her beam was just 61 feet wide, narrow enough to slice through the Pacific at over 32 knots. She wasn't built to brawl like a battleship. She was built to move, to strike, and to vanish again into the sea mist. Her power came from 4 Parsons turbines and 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers that breathed 100,000 horsepower through her bronze screws. But her real strength lay in her guns. 15 6-inch Mark 16 rifles, arranged in 5 triple turrets, capable of firing up to 10 rounds per minute per barrel. 150 shells every 60 seconds, a storm of fire that no enemy ship could withstand. Later, her enemies would call her the machine gun cruiser, a name that would stick forever. When her keel touched water on December 14, 1936, a cold wind swept across the East River. By the time she slid down the ways, her steel hull gleamed in the pale winter sun. 2 years later, on August 27, 1938, she was christened by the wife of Montana's senator. The champagne shattered, white foam running down her bow, and the name USS Helena was born. Her first years were peaceful ones. After commissioning in September 1939, she sailed on goodwill tours to South America. In Montevideo, her crew saw the scuttled remains of the German battleship Graf Spee, twisted and blackened, a grim reminder of what awaited them if war ever reached the Pacific. By 1940, Helena joined the Pacific Fleet. Her days were spent drilling under the Hawaiian sun, learning the deadly dance of naval warfare. Her crew practiced gunnery until their shoulders ached, rehearsed damage control until they could seal a bulkhead, blindfolded, and learned to trust one another in the echo of their own guns. None of them could have guessed that their first true test would come not in some far-off battle, but in the heart of what was supposed to be peace. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Helena was resting quietly at berth 1,010 inches, Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard. Across the water, Ford Island glimmered in the early light. The battleships of the Pacific Fleet lined up like sleeping giants. The crew aboard Helena went about their Sunday routine. A few men writing letters home, others cleaning decks or chatting over coffee. No one knew that within minutes they would be fighting for their lives. The first sign of trouble was the drone of engines, faint at first, then swelling into a roar. At 7:55 a.m., the world erupted, the sky filled with the black crosses of Japanese planes diving toward the harbor. Sirens wailed, the ground shook, and columns of water and fire leapt skyward as torpedoes slammed into their targets. One of those torpedoes, released by a Cape bomber flying low over the waves, was aimed for the battleship Pennsylvania. But fate intervened. Because Pennsylvania was in dry dock for repairs, her intended place at berth 1010 had been taken by Helena. The bomber pilot mistook the sleek cruiser for a battleship and let his weapon fly. The torpedo struck Helena on her starboard side, just below the armor belt. The blast ripped open her hull and flooded the forward engine room within seconds. Metal twisted, steam hissed, and men were thrown like rag dolls as the deck heaved beneath them. The shock was so violent that it blew sailors off their feet 2 decks above. Boiler room number 2 went dark. Men trapped inside struggled in chest-deep water, some clawing toward ladders, others helping the wounded. Flames raced along fuel lines. In the chaos, one petty officer dragged 3 injured men through rising seawater. His hands blistered from the heat. Later, he would refuse a medal, saying only, "They would have done the same for me." Despite the damage, Helena refused to die. Within 2 minutes, her forward diesel generator came alive. Power surged through the circuits. Her anti-aircraft crews, trained to perfection, swung their guns skyward and opened fire. The first bursts of 1.1-inch shells laced the air, followed by the deep thunder of her 5-inch mounts. The sky above Pearl Harbor turned into a storm of tracers and smoke. 4 bombs fell close, shaking the cruiser but failing to hit. Shrapnel tore through railings and lifeboats. On deck, gunners shouted over the roar of engines and gunfire, their faces streaked with soot. One man continued loading shells, even after a splinter tore through his arm, refusing to stop until the attack ended. When the raid was finally over, Helena lay blackened and wounded but afloat. 40 of her crew were dead, over 100 injured, but her flag still flew. Across the harbor, the battleships burned, their hulks bleeding oil into the sea. The Japanese reported her as sunk, unaware that the cruiser they thought destroyed had survived. That mistake would haunt them. The ship that refused to die would return, rebuilt, relentless, and thirsting for payback. When the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, Helena was barely recognizable. Her decks were scarred, her hull gashed open where the torpedo had struck, and her engine rooms lay in ruins. Yet she still floated, a crippled survivor in a harbor filled with corpses of ships that hadn't been so lucky. For days, her crew worked around the clock, pumping out water and tending to the wounded. The smell of oil, blood, and burned paint clung to every surface. The ship was alive, but only just. 2 days after the attack, on December 9th, 1941, she was eased into dry dock number 2. Naval engineers swarmed over her like doctors around a wounded giant. Sparks lit the sky as steel plates were cut and welded into place, patching her torn sides. Temporary repairs would have to hold her true salvation, waited thousands of miles away at Mare Island, California. On January 5th, 1942, Helena began her slow journey across the Pacific. It was a test of endurance for both steel and soul. Every swell pressed against her patched hull, every creak a reminder of how fragile she was. Men stood watch in the lower compartments, ready to plug leaks at a moment's notice. But the sea never found her weakness. She was tougher than she looked, and her crew knew it. When she finally arrived at Mare Island, the Navy was already changing. The shock of Pearl Harbor had awakened an industrial giant. Shipyards buzzed day and night, building, repairing, and reinventing. Helena would not just be restored, she would be transformed. Her conning tower, a relic of old design, was replaced with an open bridge to improve visibility. The outdated 1.1-inch Chicago piano anti-aircraft guns were torn out, replaced by the fearsome 40mm Bofors mounts, Swedish precision reborn in American steel. But the true revolution came from something invisible: radar. Engineers fitted Helena with the new SG Surface Search Radar, a device that could pierce the dark and find enemy ships miles away. For the first time, she could see through night and storm. To her gunners, it felt like magic. The fire control radars, designated FC and FD, transformed her main batteries into instruments of surgical death. With radar guiding her aim, she would be able to strike before the enemy even knew she was there. Under Captain Robert H. English and later Captain Gilbert C. Hoover, Helena's crew trained like men possessed. Gunnery drills, damage control, and radar tracking filled every waking hour. Damage control parties practiced sealing flooded compartments in complete darkness. Every man aboard knew why they were there: to settle a debt. When the day came for Helena to leave California, her hull gleamed with fresh paint and her guns pointed forward. As she passed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge in July 1942, the fog parted, revealing the vast Pacific ahead. Some men waved to loved ones on the shore. Others stared silently toward the horizon. The ship that should have died was going back to war, faster, stronger, and angrier than before. By October of 1942, Helena was no longer a wounded survivor. She was a hunter. Her crew, hardened by endless drills and restless nights, had turned the light cruiser into a machine of vengeance. The scars of Pearl Harbor still marked her hull, but her guns and radar were sharper than ever. The Pacific was changing, and the Solomons had become the new crucible of war. The Solomon Islands were a nightmare of jungle, coral, and death. Every night, Japanese destroyers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, raced down the slot to bombard American positions and deliver reinforcements. Guadalcanal had become the line in the sand. Whoever held it would hold the future of the Pacific. Helena, now part of Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, was about to prove just how far America had come since that Sunday morning at Pearl. Scott was one of the few admirals who understood the power of radar. He drilled his ships relentlessly in night fighting, teaching them to fight blind and strike first. But when it came time for battle, fate again made an ironic choice. Scott raised his flag aboard San Francisco instead of Helena, leaving his best radar ship to follow rather than lead. On the night of October 11th, the sea off Cape Esperance was black as ink. Helena's radar operators huddled over their screens, eyes fixed on the faint green glow. At 11:25 p.m., radioman third class Robert S. Brown spotted movement, faint echoes, then sharper blips. Enemy ships 27,000 yards away, closing fast. Helena had found them first. Admiral Aritomo Goto's task force was steaming toward Guadalcanal. Unaware they had already been spotted. 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, all sailing straight into an ambush. Scott's column turned to intercept, but confusion rippled through the formation. Signals were misread, orders garbled. The American ships accidentally crossed the Japanese TA, perfect tactical position, but no one realized it yet. On Helena's bridge, Captain Gilbert C. Hoover watched the radar returns close in. He requested permission to fire. Scott's reply came through garbled, "Roger." Was it an order to hold or to attack? Hoover made the choice that changed history. At 11:46 p.m., Helena's 5 triple turrets erupted as one. 15 6-inch guns tore open the night with a staccato rhythm that sounded like a giant drumbeat. The shells screamed across the water, slamming into the Japanese cruiser Furutaka and her flagship Aoba. Admiral Goto was killed instantly on his bridge, never realizing he had sailed into an American trap. The sea became chaos. Explosions lit the darkness like lightning. Japanese ships fired blindly, their searchlights cutting through smoke only to reveal their own doom. Helena's gunners worked like machines, shells flying so fast that the night pulsed with the rhythm of fire. When silence finally returned, the sea burned with oil and debris. Helena had fired more than 1,400 rounds in 14 minutes. The Japanese retreated, leaving wrecks and fire in their wake. It was America's first clear-surface victory of the Pacific War. As dawn broke, the men of Helena stood exhausted but triumphant. The cruiser that should have died at Pearl Harbor had just rewritten the rules of naval warfare. November of 1942 brought no rest. The Solomons were still bleeding, and Helena was right in the middle of it. After her stunning victory at Cape Esperance, she joined Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force, a patchwork of cruisers and destroyers now standing between the Japanese and Henderson Field. Both sides knew what was coming. The Tokyo Express was preparing another run, this time escorted by battleships Hiei and Kirishima. The Americans, tired but defiant, would meet them in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. On the night of November 12th, the sea was calm, and the moon half hidden behind clouds. Radar picked up echoes, faint and uncertain. Helena's operators reported multiple contacts, but confusion reigned once again. Callaghan, brave but inexperienced in radar tactics, had chosen San Francisco as his flagship, just as Scott had. Helena's superior sensors were forced to follow rather than lead. At 1:24 a.m., the enemy appeared massive shadows gliding silently through the black water. 2 Japanese battleships, a dozen destroyers, and multiple transports heading straight for Guadalcanal. Callaghan ordered a column turn to engage, but the formation fell apart. Ships crisscrossed each other's paths, friend and foe barely distinguishable. Then came the order: open fire. Helena's gunners needed no second invitation. Her radar-guided main battery roared, spitting 6-inch shells at a rate that stunned even her own crew. Her fire control team locked onto a large contact, the destroyer Akatsuki, which had foolishly switched on its searchlight to illuminate an American cruiser. Every ship in range turned its guns toward that light. The result was annihilation. Helena, San Francisco, Portland, and Atlanta unleashed a storm of steel that tore Akatsuki apart. She exploded in a blinding flash, vanishing within seconds. For a moment, it seemed like victory, but chaos was only beginning. In the confusion, San Francisco and Helena nearly collided. Friendly fire crisscrossed the sea as ships fired at shadows. Atlanta, struck by her own side, drifted helplessly into the melee. Admiral Callaghan and Captain Cassin Young were both killed when San Francisco was hit. The battle became a barroom brawl fought in pitch blackness. Through it all, Helena's radar gave her the edge. Her salvos struck with terrifying precision. She poured fire into Hiei, one of the two Japanese battleships, her shells walking across its deck and igniting secondary explosions. The massive vessel reeled under the barrage, its rudder jammed, the hull burning. For 40 minutes, the sea boiled with gunfire. Searchlights flashed, tracer rounds stitched the darkness, and the thunder of heavy guns rolled across the water. When dawn finally arrived, Hiei was crippled and drifting, her decks a mass of flames. She would be finished by American planes. Later that morning, the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. Helena emerged from the inferno with only one man dead and light damage. Though her gun barrels were worn smooth from firing over 1,500 rounds, her decks were littered with spent shell casings, and her men, blackened by smoke, could hardly speak. Iron Bottom Sound had earned its name. Dozens of ships lay beneath the waves, both American and Japanese, but through the carnage, Helena sailed on scarred, victorious, and unbroken. She had faced battleships in the dark and survived. The machine gun cruiser had once again lived up to her name. Between the thunder of battles came the silence of survival. After Iron Bottom Sound, Helena and her crew entered a different kind of war, the grinding routine that tested men as surely as combat. The Solomon Islands offered no comfort. The air hung heavy with heat and the stench of decay. Each sunrise brought the same weary rhythm: drills, repairs, bombardments, and the endless waiting for the enemy to return. By December of 1942, Helena was a veteran. Her decks bore the scars of battle, her gun barrels lined with hairline cracks, her crew aged beyond their years. They had learned to sleep through the crash of distant artillery, to eat while shells screamed overhead, to smile even when their hands trembled. Life aboard the machine gun cruiser became a pattern, one that blurred the line between endurance and madness. Each morning began with general quarters. Men rolled from hammocks before dawn, rushing to battle stations as the ship came to life. Radar screens flickered in the dim light, scanning for the faintest blip that might signal another Tokyo Express. Then came the monotony, the hours of waiting, of sweat trickling down necks as the tropical sun turned steel decks into ovens. When they weren't fighting, they worked. Rust never slept, and neither did the sea. Sailors chipped paint, scrubbed oil stains, and rewired systems damaged by shock waves. The gunners cleaned their turrets until the metal gleamed. Down below, Engineers coaxed life from turbines that had been pushed beyond their limits. Every clank and hum of machinery became a heartbeat, the rhythm of survival. In rare, quiet moments, the crew found small escapes. The ship's band, Helena's hotshots, played swing music on the fantail, their brass instruments gleaming under the dim red lights. Their rendition of Blues in the Night drifted across the black water, reaching the crews of nearby ships, like a promise that the world still held music. Others found solace in the ship's laundry somehow. Against all odds, uniforms still came out pressed and clean. In a war that devoured everything, order became defiance. Food was another battle. Canned spam, powdered eggs, and coffee so strong it could strip paint. Fresh vegetables were a memory, and ice cream was a treasure. When the ice cream machine worked, men lined up for a Dixie cup of vanilla as if it were gold. Captain Gilbert C. Hoover, who had led them through Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal, balanced discipline with humanity. He drilled his men mercilessly, but allowed moments of release, movie nights on the fantail, boxing matches on the forecastle, the rare mail call that made hardened sailors cry. He understood what kept them alive wasn't just steel or firepower, but faith in each other. But war had no mercy for sentiment. On November 23rd, Hoover was relieved of command over a bureaucratic dispute, accused of failing to report the torpedoing of the cruiser Juno. His removal hit the crew like a gut punch. They had survived hell with him, and now he was gone. His replacement, Captain Charles P. Cecil, would need to earn their trust quickly. The men of Helena didn't care for politics. They cared for survival. The sea still waited, and the enemy was never far. When Captain Charles Purcell Cecil first stepped aboard Helena in December of 1942, the ship's decks were slick with salt and sweat, and the crew eyed him with wary silence. They had lost a captain they trusted, a man who had guided them through fire and victory. Hoover's dismissal still stung like a betrayal, and now this new commander had to prove he was more than a bureaucrat's choice. Cecil understood this the moment he saluted the quarterdeck. He didn't arrive with speeches or ceremony. Instead, he walked the ship from bow to stern, talking quietly with the men, asking about the guns, the engines, the damage control gear. He wanted to know how the ship breathed, and more importantly, what the crew needed to keep her alive. By the end of that first day, the men began to notice their new captain wasn't here to replace Hoover's memory. He was here to honor it. He was tall, calm, and methodical, a man with eyes that missed nothing. He had commanded destroyers before, ships that lived or died by seconds, and that instinct never left him. He ran Helena like a living weapon, disciplined, fast, and fearless. Under his command, the ship returned to the Solomon Islands campaign with renewed focus. The machine gun cruiser was back in motion, and her guns would once again speak for her. January and February of 1943 blurred into hard, punishing months. Helena bombarded enemy positions at Vila and Munda Point, her 6-inch shells turning jungle fortifications into shredded ruin. At night, she hunted Japanese convoys, her radar sweeping the darkness for the faint flicker of movement. Each mission followed the same brutal rhythm approach under cover of night, unleash hell, and slip away before dawn. The men admired Cecil's calm during chaos. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He simply gave orders with steady precision, his voice clear even over the roar of battle. When enemy shells splashed close, he never flinched. One sailor later said, "You could feel the ship relax when the captain spoke." Cecil also cared for morale in ways that didn't make reports. He ordered extra rations of coffee and cigarettes for long patrols. He approved deck boxing matches, encouraged the ship's jazz band, and made sure the men saw a movie whenever conditions allowed. Even in war, he believed men needed moments of peace. But beneath his calm, Cecil was preparing Helena for the next great trial. Her guns were worn from months of firing. Her engines groaned from constant strain. Yet the crew refused to rest. They relined barrels, polished turrets, patched hull plates, and kept the ship running as if she were brand new. By March, she sailed south again, her wake cutting the Pacific like a blade. The machine-gun cruiser was battle-worn but unbroken, her spirit harder than the steel that carried her. Under Captain Cecil's hand, she was more than a ship. She was a promise of vengeance fulfilled, a reminder that no matter how many times fate tried to sink her, Helena would always rise to fight again. By the summer of 1943, the war had entered a new, cruel rhythm. Each island in the Solomons became a stepping stone, each victory bought with blood. For Helena, it was the same endless pattern of bombardment and patrol in and out of the slot, firing through the night, sleeping by day. But in late June, as American forces prepared to invade New Georgia, the crew sensed something had changed. Whispers spread across the decks. One more mission, one more run into danger. Operation Toenails, the code name for the New Georgia invasion, began on June 30th. Helena was assigned to provide fire support for the landings at Rendova. Her guns roared through the jungle mist, pounding enemy positions with devastating precision. Shells tore through fuel dumps and airstrips, lighting the horizon in orange flame. Japanese shore batteries fired back blindly, their shells hissing into the sea. But Helena never stopped. Each salvo landed like a heartbeat, steady, unrelenting, merciless. After hours of bombardment, silence fell. Smoke drifted over the dark water, and the gunners leaned against their turrets, exhausted. For many, it felt like any other night. They had done this dozens of times before. But for others, there was an unease that no one could name. Maybe it was the date July 4th, Independence Day, or maybe it was the moon, full and bright, stripping away the shadows that usually shielded them. That evening, at Tulagi, Helena took on fresh ammunition and fuel. Word spread quickly. A Japanese convoy had been spotted moving south. The Tokyo Express was running again, carrying reinforcements to New Georgia. Task Force 68, with Helena, Honolulu, and Street Louis, under Admiral Walden Ainsworth, would intercept them in Kula Gulf. At 11:30 p.m., the task force slipped into the Gulf, the sea calm and silver under the moonlight. Helena followed Honolulu in line ahead, her radar operators hunched over glowing screens. their hands steady. At 1:36 a.m., faint blips appeared, enemy destroyers closing from the northwest. 10 of them, commanded by Admiral Teruo Akiyama, each carried the deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedo, the most feared weapon in the Pacific. Both sides saw each other almost simultaneously. Akiyama's destroyers turned to launch. Helena's radar tracked their movement with precision, and when the order to fire came, she unleashed her fury. 15 6-inch guns opened up in perfect unison. Her first salvos found the destroyer Niizuki, Akiyama's flagship. The third salvo detonated her torpedoes, ripping the ship apart. Within minutes, Niizuki disappeared beneath the waves, taking Akiyama with her. But victory carried a price. To maintain her incredible rate of fire, Helena had switched from flashless powder to standard charges, a choice that illuminated her position like a beacon. Her blazing muzzle flashes cut through the night, marking her silhouette for Japanese torpedo directors. In the brief lull that followed, every man aboard felt the same instinct. Something was coming. At 2:03 a.m., fate arrived. 3 long-lance torpedoes sliced through the dark, unseen until it was too late. The first struck forward of turret 1. The explosion, a sunburst of flame and steel. The second and third slammed amidships. The shock threw men off their feet, split bulkheads, and plunged compartments into instant darkness. Helena's death had begun. At 2:02 in the morning, July 6, 1943, the sea around Helena erupted. The first torpedo struck her bow, just forward of turret 1, and the explosion tore through her hull with terrifying force. Men in the forward compartments never had a chance, one moment alive, the next swallowed by fire and steel. The blast hurled flaming debris into the air, lighting the night like a sunrise. Within seconds, the forward third of the ship was gone. Before anyone could grasp what had happened, 2 more torpedoes struck amidships. The detonations came in rapid succession, breaking Helena's back. The decks twisted, bulkheads buckled, and the great ship began to sag in the center. Engine rooms flooded instantly. The turbines screamed once, then fell silent as seawater smothered the fires. Power failed. Darkness swept through the passageways, broken only by the flicker of flames and the dull glow of emergency lanterns. Captain Cecil, calm even in catastrophe, gave the order no commander ever wishes to speak: abandon ship. His voice carried through the sound-powered phones, firm and steady, cutting through the confusion. But down in the handling rooms and turrets, some men refused to leave. In turret 4, the crew kept firing. The great guns roared again and again, their shells still finding targets even as seawater lapped at their boots. Turret 5 joined them, its crew manually training and elevating their barrels after the hydraulics failed. They fired until the list grew so steep that the breaches would no longer close. Only then did they climb out into the burning night. Above them, the decks were chaos. The ship was breaking apart. Men stumbled through smoke and twisted metal, dragging the wounded toward the rails. Oil fires burned across the water. The bow was already gone, the midsection rolling over, and the stern miraculously still floated, defiant. As the ship's spine gave way, Helena split into three sections. The center, containing most of the engineering spaces, sank within minutes. The bow, sheared off entirely, disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only the stern afloat with nearly 400 men still aboard. Those who made it to the rail jumped into the sea, some injured, all covered in oil. The water was warm, thick, and black. Above them, the destroyers Nicholas and Radford braved the inferno. Ignoring torpedo warnings, they charged into the debris field to haul survivors from the water. Searchlights cut through smoke, picking out faces and flailing arms. Sailors formed human chains along the destroyer decks, pulling men aboard one by one. All the while, Japanese destroyers circled in the distance, firing sporadically, hoping to finish the kill. Nicholas fired back, protecting her wounded sister as best she could. By dawn, the sea was quiet again. Flames still burned on the drifting stern, but the rest of Helena was gone, swallowed by the black waters of Kula Gulf. Nearly half her crew had perished, yet her guns had fired until the last moment. Her men fighting even as the ocean claimed them. The ship that had refused to die at Pearl Harbor had finally met her end. But she did not die quietly. She died exactly as she had lived, fighting, roaring, and unyielding. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over Kula Gulf, the sea turned from battlefield to graveyard. The shattered remains of Helena drifted amid oil slicks and wreckage, the night quiet except for the cries of the wounded. Hundreds of men floated in the dark, clinging to debris slick with fuel, the air heavy with smoke and salt. The moon that had betrayed them now hung cold and bright above a sea of ruin. Captain Cecil, bruised and burned, helped organize the survivors in the water. Around him, lifeboats were scarce. Most had been blown away or torn apart in the explosions. Men held onto wooden planks, empty barrels, or each other. The stern section, miraculously still afloat, became a haven for nearly 400 men. There, Lieutenant Commander John L. Chu took charge, his voice hoarse but steady as he called for order. The ship was gone, but the crew's discipline held. The destroyers Nicholas and Radford prowled through the wreckage, searchlights cutting across the water. Their crews worked feverishly, pulling oil-soaked sailors from the sea. They formed human chains along their decks, dragging men up with ropes and bare hands. The smell of fuel and blood filled the air. Japanese destroyers lingered in the distance, firing sporadically, but Nicholas answered with her guns, shielding the rescue with defiance. By sunrise, 739 men had been pulled from the water, but hundreds more remained adrift, too many for the destroyers to save under daylight threat. Admiral Ainsworth, with radar warning of incoming Japanese ships and aircraft, made a brutal decision. The task force had to withdraw. To stay meant death for all. Those left behind watched the rescue ships vanish into the horizon. Some shouted in anger, others simply prayed. For them, the battle was not over. The tropical sun rose high, turning the oil-coated sea into a mirror of fire. Burns blistered skin, Salt water gnawed at wounds, and thirst came quickly. Sharks circled. Men kicked at shadows beneath the surface, clinging tighter to wreckage. On the drifting stern, Lieutenant Commander Chu rationed what little remained, a few cans of water, some hardtack, medical supplies scavenged from the ruins. Watches were set, discipline maintained. When Japanese float planes appeared to strafe them, the survivors dove beneath the steel plates for cover, surfacing only when the echoes faded. As night fell again, hope came from the islands. On Vela La Vela, a New Zealand coast watcher named Reverend A.W. Sylvester spotted the drifting men through binoculars. Using a hidden radio, he reported their position to Allied command. Then, with the help of native scouts, he guided them through enemy waters towards safety. For 7 days, the survivors drifted, hid, and prayed. Some reached shore, where islanders offered food, water, and shelter, despite the risk of execution if discovered. Others floated for days longer, their minds slipping between exhaustion and delirium. When rescue finally came on July 16th, destroyers Taylor, Maury, Gwynn, and Ralph Talbot racing in under fire, only 165 remained aboard the floating stern. They were pulled to safety just as the wreck finally slipped beneath the waves. Of the original crew of 868, 700 lived, 168 never returned. But among those who survived, none ever forgot the sight of their ship's final stand, the cruiser that had fought until she broke in half and still refused to surrender. In the years that followed, Helena's name became legend, spoken in wardrooms, veterans' halls, and the quiet corners of remembrance where sailors tell their stories. Her survivors never forgot the sounds, the thunder of her guns, the groan of her steel, and the heartbeat rhythm of the ship that refused to quit. For them, she wasn't just a warship. She was a living thing, forged by hands that needed hope, manned by boys who became men, and remembered as the ship that wouldn't die. When the survivors finally reached safety, many were too weak to stand. Some had been adrift for days, sustained only by rainwater and courage. Yet even in hospital wards, they spoke not of defeat, but of pride. They had belonged to Helena, the machine-gun cruiser, the ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, crushed Japanese forces at Cape Esperance and Iron Bottom Sound, and gone down fighting in Kula Gulf with her guns still blazing. Few ships in history could claim such a record. The Navy honored her with 7 battle stars and the first ever Navy unit commendation awarded to a ship. The citation listed her battles Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, Kula Gulf, and the words that echoed in every survivor's heart: for gallantry, skill, and endurance beyond measure. But the medals and documents could never capture what Helena truly meant. Her legacy lived in the quiet stories told years later, when old sailors gathered over coffee and remembered the nights when the sea burned. For decades, her final resting place was unknown. Kula Gulf kept its secret well. Survivors held reunions, their numbers thinning with each passing year. They spoke of shipmates still down there, of the captain who went down with his ship, of the smell of cordite and the sound of her 15 guns firing in unison. They said that when she went under, the sea didn't swallow her, it saluted her. In April of 2018, 75 years after her sinking, Paul Allen's research vessel, RV Petrel, finally found her. 2,800 feet beneath the waves, cameras descended into darkness, and there she was. Her hull number, 50, still visible on the stern. Her turrets trained outward, as if still standing watch. Coral had claimed her decks, and fish swam through her passageways, but she remained unmistakably Helena, for the men who had served aboard her, those still living and those long gone. The discovery brought peace. Families of the fallen finally knew where their fathers, brothers, and sons rested. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor and defied death at every turn now rested in eternal silence, guarding her own memory beneath the Pacific. Helena's story became more than a tale of steel and war. It was a story of endurance of men who refused to surrender, and a ship that mirrored their spirit. In every rivet, every scar, she carried the weight of a generation that saved the world. They called her Machine Gun, and even in death, she still stood ready, steadfast, silent, and unbroken.